Hey there, internet friends. Welcome to That D Plus Show. Class is in session for the only show from that nerdy site that lets you know what kind of quality to expect right from the name. I'm your host, Trevor Starkey, and each week I'm sitting down with a guest to talk about a Disney Plus offering of their choosing. This is probably going to be, I don't know quite the order of everything, but currently on the docket, this is part two of the Hamilton miniseries of That D Plus Show, where we're going to be talking a lot of Hamilton for a lot of weeks here. The show is made possible entirely by the support of our patrons over at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. So if you like the show and you want to support us over there, we would definitely appreciate it. But if you can't, no big deal. The fact that you're listening is awesome. And of course, we would love it if you like, subscribe, rate, review, and share the podcast with your friends. Joining me for this second installment, at least whatever order it gets released in, this is the second installment that I'm sitting down and recording it in. We have Cameron Abbott. How you doing, Cameron?
Hey, what's going on, nerds?
What is going on? So yeah, as I said, we're doing Hamilton is now out on Disney Plus, and there are just so many people I want to sit down and talk through about and about Hamilton with that I've decided to kind of do a lot of dedicated Hamilton episodes rather than one episode, or even rather than kind of like a Hamilton panel episode, because I just want to have some fun one-on-one conversations with a lot of my friends who are in many cases getting to see Hamilton for the very first time, and that is your experience with Hamilton as well, right, Cam? This was your first time seeing the show proper.
That is correct, yeah. I mean, I've seen clips that they've put out, promotional stuff.
Yeah.
Definitely seen a lot of images and short videos. But this is for sure this is the first time I've seen the show beginning to end the way that it was done on Broadway.
Yep.
And it was an incredible experience.
Yeah, so tell me, before we dive into kind of the history lesson of the show, tell me a little bit about your personal history with Hamilton. I know we've had many a conversation about it. You are one of the Hamil Bros here from That Nerdy Site.
Well, to be
so tell me
to be fair, I'm not a Hamil Bro.
Oh, that's right. It was me, Ben, Alex, and Logan were the Hamil Bros, weren't we? And you were kind of one of the you always were like, I want to be a Hamil Bro. Let me be a Hamil Bro.
Yeah, no, I was not I was like, oh, you guys are the Hamil Bros. That's cool. Would have liked to have been involved in that, but also I'm the kind of person where if I am interested in something that I don't think is gonna be of note or interesting to other people, I usually just don't talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's.
I'm not a big I'm not a big evangelical person when it comes to the things I love, which has been a struggle when you're trying to be part of the enthusiast, industry.
Yeah.
Um, you
It
have to
goes
be
back to
enthused.
what we talked about, even in the very first episode of that D Plus show, in that you are a Disney diehard kind of fan, but you don't really shout it from the rafters or shout it out on Twitter all that much. So yeah, that's probably what had happened was we'd probably talked about Hamilton at any number of kind of funny events or stuff like that I knew vocally. Where Alex and Logan and Ben all kind of lied on the subject, but was not aware of your love for the show until I think we started kind of coining the idea of Hamil Bros.
Well, yeah, you guys were like, we're the Hamil Bros now, and it's like, that's cool. And then I think it was at PSX 2016 where I was like, I don't know, maybe I can be maybe I'm like the George Washington to the Hamil Bros. And then somebody said, no, you're the Thomas Jefferson to the Hamil Bros. I was like, you know what, I'll take it. That works. I'm
Yeah,
happy to be the Thomas Jefferson to the Hamil Bros.
That's what I'm specifically thinking back to, because it would have been. Yeah, it either would have been PSX 2016 or 2017. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember specifically that being where there was an instance where Ben and Alex and I were all together, and we basically took a picture and sent it to Logan or something like that on Twitter. And we're like, look, it's three-fourths of the Hamil Bros or something. And yeah, that might be where you would weighed in on oh, I'll be if because it was Alex was probably Hamilton, I was probably pushing to be, I don't know, Lafayette or something like that. One of us would have been Lawrence, one would have been Hercules Mulligan kind of thing. And so yeah, you may have weighed in on, okay, well, I'll be George Washington. And I think ultimately, I talked about this a little bit with Logan. I feel like in our friend group, I probably identify as the George Washington character, as the let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and full of glory.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because I'm the quote unquote elder statesman of our little pocket of the community or something like that. I definitely try and pass on that wisdom to other people when I can. So yeah, I think the the idea of like us being that set of four characters as the Hamill Bros, I think kind of has moved on, and we've moved away from that. But yeah, that's certainly, I think, in our community, I think I definitely look at myself as a bit of the George Washington character of like, yeah, let me try and educate you so you can learn from my mistakes.
And I definitely, especially at that
industry.
time, I had a bit more of like a. It's a definitely a bad habit of mine, but I oftentimes can't like need to like have a say about something.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare there's subjects where I will more now that I'm older, there's a lot more subjects I'm willing to let go by without putting any input on.
Yeah.
Just because I've learned that like, you know, I don't have to attach my voice to everything, even if I feel a certain way about it. Which is weird because that's diametrically opposed from the idea of like being enthused by something and telling people about it. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I've just gotten a bit more conservative about kind of like sharing my opinion on every single matter.
Yeah,
Because
I mean,
yeah,
there are plenty of things that I'll see like come across my timeline. I'll just be like, I disagree with that, but not enough to like engage with this conversation on Twitter.
yep,
Like, and I just kind of like, I'm like, okay, well, I don't agree with that take, so I'm just gonna also scroll on. I don't need to weigh in on every single thread I see on Twitter.
yep. I will say though, however, that at that time I definitely was a bit of a uh, I would definitely what's the right word I'm looking for? Repudiate. Um,
Maybe.
maybe no, repudiate sounds like it has to do with like reputation. I would definitely have a response to a lot of things. Like somebody would say something, and I would be sometimes the first person and to say like, I am in direct contradiction to that thought, and here's the reason why you're dumb. And so
Okay. You refute. You would
refute.
often
Thank
refute
you.
those
That's the word I
things.
was looking for.
Yeah.
I was definitely like I definitely had a more refutable um, approach to conversations, and I was that definitely colored the early stages of like Ben and my relationship and Logan's and my relationship. Um, Let me rephrase that. It definitely colored the relationships I had with everybody at the time. So for it to be like, no, you're definitely the Thomas Jefferson. It's like, yeah, I think like that works. That fits. Like I'm not the villain of like what's going on, but I'm also like I'm not the Aaron Burr of what's happening in this group of people, but I'm definitely something like I can definitely be an antagonizing figure.
Yeah.
So like definitely felt like like I fit definitely into that Thomas Jefferson role at that time. Like you said, it's been years since then, so like the dynamics of our relationships have drastically changed in many cases. And looking back on it now, but for my origin point, like when Hamilton first got on Broadway back in like 2015 or off Broadway in 2015 when they did the recording for it.
Yeah.
That recording kind of circulated among my musical theater friends,
Mm-hmm.
and I caught onto it very early because um, this is at a point where like I was really big into like Childish Gambino and other things, and a friend of mine brought it to my attention, and he's like, it's really incredible because it takes the approach of Alexander Hamilton was kind of the quote unquote outcast of the founding fathers in that he was an immigrant, he was a self-made man. He didn't have like he wasn't known for being genial or like he was an abrasive person and very open about knowing that he was abrasive and like indulging in it. To the point where like there's a really interesting film put out years ago about the founding of like the Constitutional Convention that led to the U.S. Constitution. And not Aaron Burr, sorry, Alexander Hamilton's played by, I'm trying to remember his name. He's the lead actor in Memento. He was
Guy Pearce.
Guy Pearce, yeah. Guy Pearce plays Alexander Hamilton in this film.
I just rewatched Iron Man 3, so
There you go, yeah.
uh,
So
it's fresh on my mind.
and Guy Pearce is an excellent Alexander Hamilton in this film because it's an important note is that during the Constitutional Convention, the New York delegation got called back from New York, and Alexander Hamilton went with them back to New York. And Hamilton was written a letter by James Madison that he's like just like asking for advice, and eventually was just like I need somebody else here who can help me convince people that this Constitution's worth it. And that's when Hamilton sweeps back in. He's there for important points, including being a signature on the Constitution for the intent of New York's representation, because otherwise New York would not have had a representative to sign it. Uh, and became one of the biggest radical, like borderline radical people at the Constitutional Convention. As stipulated in the song, he proposed his own
Goes and proposes his own form of government.
And it's
Yo, who the F is this?
Yeah, it's important to note also, Alexander Hamilton's idea of government was basically like the conservative wet dream of government, like the libertarian wet dream of government, where basically we should all just follow like natural law, and everybody should already know it because everybody should be smart enough to know it. And if you break it, that's like there you go. You get hurt, like you get punished for it. And people were like, we need like actual like rules of how to like legislate and how to do things. So no, like it's very incredible because he's such he's such a high-minded figure. Like he thinks on such a high level of intellectual thought processing that the experiences of the layman, the experiences of the common man, are absent in a lot of the things that he's done, like he did throughout his life. Because he lived a life of exceptionalism, and normalcy just never factored into his life. And that's an incredible, and they definitely pointed out the idea of why do you write like you're running out of time? Like this entire idea of the man was nonstop. All of that is literally about his grind and his talent and his genius. But at the end of the day, he was such I love Alexander Hamilton's place in history is very unique and very interesting. But it should also be noted, and I always get a little weird feeling of irony when I see my friends who I know are lean more, socialist democrat or socialist or even communist, more ideologies, the idea of anti-capitalism. I should actually preface it by saying people who have anti-capitalistic politics, seeing them praise the musical, or oh, I love this musical, it's so great, and it's I love that you are loving this musical, but it's literally a celebration of the life of the chief architect of our speculative capitalist system that we are entrenched in problems in right now. Granted, he created the system 200 plus years ago when things were very different.
Yeah.
So you can't lay the problems of modern capitalistic society at Alexander Hamilton's feet. But he's not this populist hero that I think a lot of people have tried to frame it. I don't think Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator, tried to frame it this way. But I think that in the idea of bringing up that, and focusing so much on his immigrant story, the story that he is a legal bastard. Alexander Hamilton and his siblings, when his mother died, were locked out of their inheritance from her, and her legal husband, came from Scotland to claim the inheritance and went back without the kids, leaving them destitute and stranded. That is a real thing that happened to him. He experienced these real life tragedies early in his life that really helped define the exceptional life that he would end up living. But and so I think the idea of from rags to from the bottom rung to power, public service, the ideology that's very notable and noble about Hamilton's story is definitely has done a lot of obscuring of kind of his less than great tendencies, consolidating central power for there's for an example, during the Revolutionary War, credits were given to farmers that basically could later be cashed in with the government for money. These chips, essentially you could think of them like gambling chips. They were basically these notes of IOUs, and you can go ahead and at a future point in time they'll be worth money. What they'll be worth, we don't know yet, but they'll be worth money. And so there were hundreds if not thousands of farmers across the continental United States who, out of patriotism and pragmatism, gave supplies to the Continental Army that would then, form the Continental Congress and then establish the United States government. And when it came time, like, oh, hey, we should actually start paying these back, the notes became of a interested note to people within Hamilton's financial circle of Wall Street, where there was a part where these bankers were going out to the countryside all throughout the United States and basically buying these notes for pennies on the dollar, knowing that they would be worth more when they got back to New York and actually traded them in. Because the way that information traveled at the time, these people out in the countryside would have no knowledge that the government was getting ready to pay them back. And so when Thomas Jefferson makes an accusation in the second act of Hamilton at Hamilton about like these speculative, like he makes the point of talking about his speculative capitalistic intentions, which is essentially and he mentions like trading chips in. That's a reference to that point, that historical note of like Hamilton was involved in some not great, pretty shady stuff regarding the foundation of our capitalistic system. So it's interesting. I love the Easter eggs about that are definitely throughout the entire musical. The biggest one is the situation of Hamilton's adulteries, having such a focus point because you can't ignore the Reynolds pamphlet.
Yeah.
Because it destroyed his political career. Anyway, sorry, I've been talking for a while, but
no,
I definitely love this.
It's good because you inadvertently tacked into one of the areas that I would have kind of circled back to in a little bit, because normally obviously we have this segment of like how does this hold up, which we look at a lot with some of the older stuff, and one of the conversations really is how does this hold up it's a musical that came out in 2015, 2016, and how does it hold up being released here in 2020 amidst the last 6 months of the world going on, and I think so you've kind of just touched on a lot of the financial ramifications of how does this hold up in terms of in relationship to kind of the conversations around the capitalist society right now and all that stuff. So good conversation.
Yeah, where corporations right now are definitely valuing money over lives of workers. Yes.
Yeah. So a little bit of history diving into the show. Originally released July 3rd, 2020. Other notable releases of the recent weeks were all coming out on June 26th. Here we have the Eurovision Song Contest that was released to Netflix. You have Irresistible, which is the Jon Stewart-directed Steve Carell film, which was put out in the limited theaters that are still running stuff, as well as put out on demand. And then you have My Spy, which is the Dave Bautista. He's a spy with a little kid kind of following him around, that has been put out, available on Amazon Prime. Runtime of 2 hours and 40 minutes with basically a 1 minute intermission built in there if you want to kind of treat it as like a 1 act and 2 act play. And then in the Disney timeline of things, we have this came after Artemis Fowl, which came to Disney Plus June 12th. And you can hear mine and Cameron's thoughts very wonderfully kind of summarized by Cameron's laughter right there. That came out June 12th. You can hear that in one of our recent episodes of That D Plus show. And then we're kind of in a no man's land. Who knows what actually will be the next live action thing from Disney. Currently, it is scheduled to be Mulan, which as of today, recording this, again, just like Logan's episode, I'm recording this on July 5th. That is currently slated, Mulan is currently slated to be released August 21st, 2020, but who knows if we'll actually be seeing people return to the theaters by then, especially as the ongoing kind of COVID-19 pandemic kind of continues to ravage the world. Or not even the world, specifically the States, because we're fucking morons.
The rest of the world, we're like, hey, we're going to take these precautionary measures and take care of it.
Yeah. Yeah. As far as the who's who of the film, I'll kind of run through this because a lot of this I've already gone over in previous episodes, but you have the director, Thomas Kail, who also directed the stage version of the show, as well as this filmed version. Previously, he had directed Grease Live back in 2016, and then he's also been a director of a few episodes of the TV show Fosse Verdon. As far as the writer,
He was directed TV shows. What TV show?
TV show Fosse Verdon, about Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon, I believe.
Okay,
I want to say it's Sam Rockwell is Fosse and Michelle, what's her name from Greatest Showman and various other things. And her name's escaping me, but I'm pretty sure she plays Gwen Verdon in that. But yeah, it's kind of a look at their relationship from their days on and off the boards.
Okay, that's fair.
So yeah,
I was asking because
very
it sounded like you were
theatrical-driven
having
show.
a stroke.
Oh no, Fosse Verdon.
Fosse Verdon.
No.
Fosse Verdon. That's such a...
Who is that?
Sorry. As somebody who's never heard either of those names before, totally threw me off. I was like, I have no frame of reference for that.
Michelle Williams is who I was.
Oh, okay,
thinking
yeah,
of.
it's Sam Rockwell and Michelle Williams, huh?
Yeah. Let me
You
double
think I would've
check
heard of
that. Pull that right up here. It's on FX. I think it was a mini series-ish thing. Just in the last couple years. I believe Michelle Williams even won the Emmy for it, and that was when she went out and said like that basically like pay women what they're worth kind of thing, and like let women have creative input, and she talks about being so grateful that the people on Fosse Verdon let her have creative input on and gave her the things she felt she needed for the character. I remember that coming out.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Go Michelle Williams.
Yeah, good for her. The writer of the show, of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda, wrote the book for it. Previously, he's also written the music for Force Awakens and Moana and Rise of Skywalker. And then he is also the writer of the play and then soon-to-be film adaptation In the Heights, which would have theoretically come out already had it not been delayed by COVID stuff. So yeah, that's currently tentatively slated. I believe they just kicked it to next summer because they really want it to be a summer movie.
Well, it's such the story is such a summer tale for like what they're talking about
absolutely.
in the musical.
It happens over 4th of July weekend, basically.
Like it's so good. Like In the Heights is so good, people. Like I haven't seen the film, but like just the music alone is phenomenal. So I can't wait. Yep.
And then also you have Ron Chernow, who inspired this show with his book Alexander Hamilton. Ron Chernow has also written Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, Washington, A Life, and Grant, about Ulysses S. Grant.
I'd be curious what he has to say about Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah, I believe that's his most recent kind of historical fiction piece or historical nonfiction piece. So yeah, that's out there. I think Logan mentioned it's on his like wish list to sit down and read as well.
I will say Ulysses S. Grant, for people who don't know, had a horrendous case of PTSD for basically his entire life. And you can see that with his behavior and stuff. Interesting man.
It's interesting, like recording Logan earlier today and now you, because you two are the most like history buffs that I imagine I'll be having this conversation with. So you guys are bringing the most like real life historical context, whereas I can weigh in on like, hey, here are all the musical references that happen in the show, and I have like a whole bunch of trivia and fun facts about the show because I've read so much about it. But you guys have like the real deal like historical backing behind it. And, like Logan had himself read both the Alexander Hamilton biography as well as Washington, A Life from Ron Chernow there. Starring, you have Daveed Diggs playing the Marquis de Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson.
He's incredible.
He was also the writer star of Blindspotting from 2018. He is in the TV series Snowpiercer, and then he will be eventually, when these start coming out, he will be in the upcoming Pixar movie Soul, as well as he is slated to play Sebastian in the live-action version of The Little Mermaid that they're doing. And yeah, I didn't shout this out in the previous episode, but like one of the most awe-inspiring things about watching this version of Disney Plus is how masterfully Daveed Diggs enunciates.
Oh,
especially given like his role and how both with like, especially with Lafayette, it's Lafayette is like a friggin' miracle and a testament to Daveed Diggs' skill, because not only is he doing the accent, but he's also doing some of the fastest rapping in the show. One of the little tidbits on that character that I love is he goes from not having the best grasp on the American language with anarchy, how you say, anarchy, to his like rapping, his rapid fire rapping through guns and ships, and being really the most masterful one with language in the show probably, and yeah, the fact that he enunciates everything clearly, you don't need the subtitles like to understand what he's saying and when he's saying it and stuff, is just phenomenal work from him. So shout out to Daveed Diggs, absolutely.
He's
and then also, yeah, check out some of those other things he's worked on.
I could say on every facet and every level, that man can take me away.
We also have Renee Elise Goldsberry playing Angelica Schuyler, who I've noted here was Mimi in the 2008 Rent filmed live on Broadway. If you've ever seen that recording of Rent. And then she's also been in the TV series Altered Carbon. You have Jonathan Groff, of course, we talked about in our Frozen episode. He's playing King George here. He is Kristoff in the Frozen films. He has also done Spring Awakening on Broadway. He was in the TV series Glee for a little while. And then he is slated to be in the upcoming Matrix 4.
Wait, what?
Christopher... Yeah, it's on his IMDb in pre-production for Matrix 4. I don't know who he's going to be. Probably somebody in...
What even is the Matrix 4 going to be about? Like, the Matrix... the Matrix trilogy ended very conclusively.
Did you not know that that's coming back?
No.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing. Like, I believe COVID has changed release dates all around and stuff, but there was even a point where... Because Keanu Reeves is coming back for it. And Matrix 4 and John Wick 4 were basically set for the same release date. Again, I think that has shifted around now. But yeah, that's who's the Wachowskis are coming back for a Matrix 4.
Wachowskis, yeah.
Yep.
I don't think I pronounced it right either. Wachowskis. It's Wachowskis. You're right. You were right. Never mind. I was like, I don't think that's right. Nope, you were right. I will say, after John Wick 3, I could go without a 4. Like, I'm all right. Let's go ahead and give Matrix 4 a shot. Why not?
I've not seen any of the John Wicks, so I can't speak to that at all. And it's been so long, and I feel like I really only watched the Matrix movies probably like once, after like Matrix 2 and 3 at least once. So that's one that, like, I'm sure Kind of Funny will eventually do as an in review for when the Matrix 4 is coming out, and it's one that will be fascinating to go back and revisit. Christopher Jackson, of course, playing George Washington here, was also the singing voice of Chief Tui in Moana, aka Moana's father. Not the like acting voice, just in the song. And then he's also in the CBS TV series Bull. Jasmine Cephas Jones plays Peggy Schuyler and Mariah Reynolds. She was also in Blind Spotting with Daveed Diggs up there, and she also has a small part in Marriage Story, where she's one of the actors.
Okay, no, we have to stop for a second. She's both Peggy and Mrs. Reynolds?
And Mariah Reynolds, yeah. Oh yeah, like this is something that Logan and I touched on a little bit in our episode because of your realization at
we
the
talked
end
about the other day
that Hercules Mulligan and James Madison were the same actor, and you didn't realize that until the end credits kind of came up. But yes, Peggy Schuyler is also Mariah Reynolds.
She's incredible. Oh my gosh, she's incredible.
Yeah, did you really think that, like, just like you thought, like, oh, it sucks that, like, if you get cast as Hercules Mulligan, you're only in the first act. Did you also think that the person in the first act is only like, and Peggy?
Yeah.
And just didn't do anything the rest of the show?
You have no idea. I imagined that she would be in like some ancillary spots.
She's one of the ensemble characters, yeah.
Not just necessarily ensemble, like she might be costumed up as Peggy for like the Schuyler scenes. Mm-hmm. Like if they did anything with like the like when it's like, like your like Grandpa lost to Aaron Burr, like maybe if like they show, because they do show Mr. Reynolds, or not Mr. Reynolds, Mr. Schuyler in like different parts of the show. There is an actor who's costumed as him, so I assumed there would be like that situation with Peggy. I didn't know that she was double casted as Mariah Reynolds. Wow.
Yeah, no, Peggy just disappears in Act 2 and is replaced as
Lin-Manuel Miranda so Alexander Hamilton, Mariah Reynolds, like, I didn't know how they were going to do it, but damn, like, that got, like, heated and very uncomfortable because I did not approve, of course, nobody's gonna root against Eliza. Like
yeah.
nobody's gonna root against Liza. Get out of here. Like Eliza's the best.
Yeah.
Best of wives and best of women, man.
So I will. We talked about this in the Logan episode as well, but I'll throw it out here because I imagine it will blow your mind. Because you and I talked a couple days ago about Hamilton extensively, and it was like we need to save some of this for the podcast. But I mentioned that like the opening number, Alexander Hamilton, has all those great lines where you see Lawrence basically say, I died for him. And that's a reference to the actor who plays both Lawrence, who dies in the first act, and Philip, who dies in the second act. You have the women all saying, me, I loved him. And that's not all the Schuyler sisters saying they loved him. It's,
oh my gosh.
It's Eliza, it's Angelica,
You're
and it's
right.
Mariah Reynolds saying that they loved him. And then you have Lafayette and Hercules Mulligan saying, me, I fought with him. And in the first act, they're fighting with him, as in they're fighting alongside him. And then the second act, those actors who are obviously playing Jefferson and Madison are fighting against him, but they're fighting with him in that sense. So wonderful introduction to all those different dynamics and the perfect and deliberate double casting of all of those performers.
I will also state, weirdly enough, after we talked about that, I had the thought. So, are you familiar with Romance of the Three Kingdoms?
I am not. No.
Okay, there's a part in Romance of the Three Kingdoms where three of the main characters, who are close friends, part ways, and the next time they see each other, they're adversaries. And so that for some reason that popped into my head. I was like, it's kind of like Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Anyway, that's it. Just a little tidbit.
Yeah.
Shout out to Romance of the Three Kingdoms, by the way. Incredible piece of classical literature.
All right. So obviously we have Lin-Manuel Miranda here, playing Alexander Hamilton, the titular character. Also in Mary Poppins Returns, he was one of the big advocates to keep Brooklyn Nine-Nine when it was briefly canceled, and so he ended up getting a guest appearance on that show as Amy Santiago's brother. He's in the series His Dark Materials, and as well as he plays Gizmo Duck in the new DuckTales series. And then eventually, when In the Heights does come out, he will be stepping into the role of Piragua Guy for that. He's a little too old to be playing Usnavi, but he will still be making his kind of like cameo in that show as Piragua Guy. Leslie Odom Jr. playing Aaron Burr, of course. He was featured on Smash, the short-lived, I want to say 2-season show about basically like being on Broadway and making musical theater. He was also in Murder on the Orient Express, and then he was also in the film Harriet. And Okirite Onaduan played Hercules Mulligan and James Madison here, which blew Cameron's mind when he saw that for the first time. He has done a couple episodes of Ballers. He's been in a few episodes of Grey's Anatomy, and he will be in A Quiet Place Part 2 in a small part when that eventually comes out, but he's much more kind of on the stage is where he kind of makes his bread and butter. Anthony Ramos plays John Laurens and Philip Hamilton, was in A Star is Born and Godzilla King of Monsters, as well as Trolls World Tour, playing what I assume is the Skrillex character on that, because he's playing a character called King Trollix. And then he will be taking over the role of Usnavi in the Heights when that eventually makes its way onto to film or into theaters. And then lastly, Philippa Sue playing Eliza Hamilton was also in Smash, and she is in the upcoming Netflix animated film Over the Moon. So keep an eye out for that. A couple little bits of trivia here for you that we haven't gone over in other episodes. Touched on this probably a little bit in the last episode, but this was filmed over the course of 3 days in June 2016, started by filming a live Sunday matinee performance with cameras in the audience, after which the cast and crew spent the rest of the day and evening filming close-ups, dolly shots, and crane shots. Filming continued all day Monday, which is normally the cast's day off. That is typically the dark day on Broadway. They did more close-ups and Steadicam footage that day. And then more filming took place on Tuesday morning before shooting another live performance on Tuesday evening with the cameras again in the audience but in different positions. Lin-Manuel Miranda said, "It was basically a 3-day film shoot with the best rehearsed cast in the history of the movies because we'd all been doing the show for a year at this point." And then elsewhere we have Several cast members have connections to Disney films. Lin-Manuel Miranda, aka Alexander Hamilton, wrote the songs for Moana, as I said, and starred as Jack the Lamplighter in Mary Poppins Returns. Jonathan Groff was the voice of Kristoff in the Frozen franchise. Christopher Jackson was the singing voice of Chief Tui, and Daveed Diggs is going to be playing Sebastian in the upcoming Little Mermaid remake, as well as he will be the voice of Paul in the Pixar movie Soul. So kind of went over all those little things, but that's all the Disney nuggets rolled into one there. And then again, it's not included here, but Lin-Manuel is also in DuckTales, so you can check that out because that's a friggin' great show. So yeah, well, I'll leave many of the other trivia tidbits for future episodes, but I also have with me right here alongside me Hamilton the Revolution, which is the kind of behind the scenes book. I encourage any big fan of Hamilton to go and track down and find out. It was written by Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jeremy McCarter, and it is basically half behind the scenes making of Hamilton and half like very detailed liners notes for the album of Hamilton. So you have basically every song, the lyrics written out kind of with character breakdowns, as well as like detailed footnotes from Lin-Manuel Miranda about like certain meanings of certain lines. A lot of the references to kind of notable hip hop as well as notable musical theater references are included in there. So as we kind of discuss elements of the show, if we kind of land on a song that we're kind of doing some focus on or something, I might dive in and pull out a little tidbit footnote here or there from Hamilton the Revolutionary. Definitely check that out if you are a fan of the series. So yeah, kind of we've already touched on a lot of the like does it hold up in terms of the context of kind of Hamilton's role in leading us down this path to where the financial system is that we currently exist in. I would argue that inherently the system he was putting in place wasn't, necessarily bad or good. I think it has absolutely been exploited, especially as we've seen kind of deregulation happen in the last 50 years, 30 years, 40 years, I guess, back during Reaganomics era and stuff. I think is when we saw kind of most of the real deregulation kind of take their toll on the financial system of America, and that's where we saw obviously the significant uptick of billionaires start coming into. It's actually
where we reality. Started seeing it was in the 1994 repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act.
Yeah.
Which was under the Clinton administration. That was part of a brokerage deal between Republicans and Democrats to end the government shutdown at the time.
Okay.
Sorry, just some context there with that.
No,
Reaganomics definitely set the tone for what we would end up seeing, but it's yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right. Glass-Steagall absolutely was probably the pivotal point. I don't remember who it was. God, it might have been Elizabeth Warren. I remember seeing like an extensive conversation and interview about that as a real turning point for the kind of dichotomy of the economic system in America on The Daily Show at some point. So I don't remember if it was Elizabeth Warren, but I know it's certainly something she has spoken at length on as well, from her kind of history of teaching about it and analyzing it and stuff.
Oh, for sure. And by the way, we had the Frank Dodd Act put in place after 2008, the financial crisis then. However, the Frank Dodd Act was repealed in 2016. So heads up, folks.
Okay. Yeah. So are there any other like things you want to kind of touch on in terms of how does this hold up? Like Logan and I talked a little bit in terms of like the show's place in the context of, slavery in the conversation around Black Lives Matter, as well as kind of the glorification of these historical figures alongside the tearing down of Confederate statues and problematic members of kind of history. Anything you want to kind of touch on in those categories, or because I touched on a tweet that I had shared that I'd retweeted that basically talks about the idea that like Alexander Hamilton can absolutely be connected to his issues with slavery and that be an issue, but at the same hand, like you can also see Hamilton the show as a very once in a lifetime kind of piece of art that provided great opportunities specifically for actors of color and specifically black actors, those two statements are not mutually exclusive. Like
I think that's a good point.
Hamilton, the man, can be, condemned for his role in perpetuating slavery in the in American society, but he can also be celebrated for inspiring this great piece of art.
It's important to note something. This is something that's been on my mind recently, especially after talking to some folks about it over the past week or so. If you're trying to look back into history and find unproblematic people, you're not going to find them because they're like problematic people are a product of problematic times. For most cases, there's of course outliers that you'll find every once in a while, and we should definitely lift these people up. And but in 50 years, well, these people we're lifting up now be like, depending on the standards of 50 years from now, like, could we like we don't know what the future holds for
Yeah.
culture and normalized practices of how we go about our lives. There's a difference between people being a part of people being problematic because they were members of a problematic time, and people who deliberately went out of their way to try to enforce and preserve a way of life that left people enslaved and was intentionally fought under the belief and idea that the cornerstone of society was that black and colored people were were supposed to be under the rule of a white upper class, period. Those people fought a war and they lost, and the statues that got put up for them were not put up for the sake of preserving history, but were rather put up as a reminder of quote unquote white dominance in places where racial tensions were rising as a way of antagonizing a group of people. So like when it comes to like who do we, and I think a big part of this also comes to the question of like Mount Rushmore. My feelings about Mount Rushmore aren't that like, hey, those four guys up there aren't necessarily the best people in the history of the United States. My problem with the Mount Rushmore is that monument shouldn't have been built in the first place. That is sacred land that belongs to the Sioux people and should be returned to them. What they decide they want to do with the monuments there, that's their business. If they want to let them be, great. If they want to blow them up, great. If they want to spray paint graffiti on them, that is their sacred land and it should be returned to them. Do I think that means that we should definitely pull down like the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Monument? No, I don't think that. I think if you want to look back into the past and find problematic behavior, you will find it because people are a product of their time. However, what we can do is recognize that flawed people can sometimes achieve really great things. And if the flaws they have are the flaws that were inherent in the society that they lived in, then sure, they didn't do anything to change that, or maybe they changed in minor ways. People look at Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton as an example of people who owned slaves, so that means they were bad people. And it's like, it's not exactly a one-to-one with that because, and I'm not going to apologize for slave owning, you never should apologize for it, that's wrong and bad and shouldn't be done. But to then say, well, it's the contradiction within these men. These men, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, both wanted to end slavery. But there becomes, and it's a part of the Hamilton mixtapes, the kind of prototype song that was going to be the third cabinet battle.
Yeah.
Of Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington basically hashing it out like, so we end slavery, what happens then? And that's a big question. We were talking about people, if they just end slavery, cool. We saw what happened when we ended slavery. If you're unfamiliar with the ending of slavery in the 13th Amendment and the ramifications that it had, watch the 13th, which is a documentary about the 13th Amendment, the prison system, the justice system, as well as the constant use of it to oppress people of color, primarily black people. And you'll see that the first thing that the South did after losing slavery is start using prison labor instead. And what they started doing with prison labor is they made laws to put people in prison for anything that could arbitrarily be put against them, which led to the mass incarceration of black men in the South and black women in the South to basically fulfill the void that the vacuum and the void that slavery left was filled by prison labor for the most part during the Reconstruction era. And that's a very watered down summary of what happened. Please go watch that documentary. It's very important.
Yeah, that definitely speaks to something that Logan and I also discussed in his episode. The idea that, like, one of the ideas that led to maybe the Cabinet Battle number 3 getting cut from the show is that it does kind of end without any resolution. It does end with them just kind of kicking the can down the road, and we don't, like, obviously all you have to do is look around to today to see, you know, what is the result of that kind of thing happening and still and not being cut off at the founding of the country.
And I think it's
unfortunate that, like, 240 years later we're still dealing with the fallout of it in profound ways that often have too often been overlooked. But there is also an element to the idea of, like, you can look back at there's a picture that goes around. It's one of the famous I want to say John Trumbull portraits of kind of the Constitutional Convention or the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's one of those, like, iconic, like, you see all these founding fathers in the picture, and somebody has gone through and basically, like, put little pink dots over all the people who were slave owners, and you end up with, like, maybe like a fifth, probably fewer than that, of the people in that picture.
There's like 3 people. Only 3 people in that picture
that are unobstructed kind of thing, and so it is the idea of, like, one of the things Logan and I kind of discussed is the idea that like, these people were not so naive to realize the issues with slavery and that system, but they also weren't able to completely, like, break that system. The reference I made in the earlier episode is the idea of that Washington says, speaking specifically to hopping into the French Revolution, of we're too fragile to start another fight. I think that also plays into, like, the country was very weak in its founding. It's not like this. It wasn't 240 years old. It didn't have that foundation. It could crumble at any moment.
Yeah.
And if they had delved into trying to end slavery and whatnot at that time, given how we talked about this back when we would do when we did West Wing in it, and there were specific issues that kind of broached the topic of race or whatever. I went through and kind of, like, mapped it out and was like, if you think of, you know, the not even the founding of the country, but, like, when the slave trade, you know, really started hitting our shores back in the 1600s or whatever, all the way up until the end of slavery, like, America has still been a slave-owning country more than it has been a not slave-owning. It wasn't always a country for all of that, but, like, slavery has been a much larger part of America's history than not, still to this day. Let alone, you know, the idea of, like, non-white people having quote-unquote equal rights under the law, as, you know, in theory, if not in practice. That's been a sliver of America's history compared to the predominant history where it has not been the case. And that is it's something that, like, this country is absolutely kind of dealing with and wrestling with right now. And I think it is something that you see explored in the show, in Hamilton itself, even if it's not something that they can dedicate, you know, a full time to in a 2.5 hour musical, in a 3 hour musical. Like, you can't dive into the troubled past of all these characters, but the show introduces these characters and introduces them as flawed characters. nobody in this show, save maybe Eliza, walks out of this show unscathed.
That's true.
Everybody has kind of their demons and their past that is at least referenced in this show, and I think that the show opens the door to that conversation in a way that certainly in a way that statues fucking don't. So fuck the statues. Like, this show absolutely has more relevance, and this show has performed on Broadway longer than the Confederacy existed. So fuck yeah, Hamilton has more cultural resonance than add it to that meme of things.
I will say it's important to note that the Confederacy that we refer to as the Second Confederacy of America, or the Second Confederate States of America. People oftentimes forget the First Confederacy was after the Revolution, like during the period of time after the Revolutionary War, prior to the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, it was what, the Confederate States of America before the United States?
That's correct.
It's like, because, who's the first American president? George Washington. It's always that like little trivia footnote kind of thing.
Because we weren't and it's important to note that the Confederacy was built off of when the colonies were rebelling, they were trying to figure out, well, how do we make a coalition between all 13 of us? And how do we make sure that troops aren't just going to be centered around places like Philadelphia, New York, that they like other interests and like other population centers will be protected. And part of that was, and it was Benjamin Franklin who proposed it. He brought up the Confederacy of the I want to say it's the Iroquois. The Iroquois, which essentially is a bunch of tribes that live within the Confederacy of the Iroquois, and they all live separately as tribes, make their own rules and laws, but when time comes to unite, they unite as a single nation. And that's a very, 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 once again, watered down explanation of what the Iroquois nation is. They're a proud and wonderful people with an incredible culture behind them. That being said, Benjamin Franklin proposed this because it would allow each colony to maintain its what's the word I'm looking for? It's basically its right to rule itself. And this was a big part of the Constitutional Convention, is you had 13 colonies, 13 different cultures, 13 different monies. Like, not every colony used the same monetary system after the Revolutionary War. Each state started printing their own money, and it led to trade debacles because people would try to use New Jersey money in Georgia. And people in Georgia were like, well, the New Jersey money's basically worthless. Like, I'm not going to take your New Jersey money. It means nothing to me here. And so, that was a massive part of why we needed the Constitutional Convention. Another thing was, whenever the Constitutional, or the Continental Congress was sending people overseas to be diplomats, John Adams, who was the diplomat to England, was not accepted as the ambassador from the United States, or from the colonies, basically, or the former colonies as they referred to it, because they weren't an actual government. They didn't have a constitution. Their Articles of Confederation were loose and non-binding. Anybody could basically come and go as they pleased, and it was designed that way for the ease of war. But when we finally needed to come together as a nation, it required a lot of compromise, and a lot of compromise. I mean, the original Senate was not decided by the popular vote. It was decided by state legislatures, because it was supposed to be immune to the pulls of democratic selection by curating specific people. Once again, it also should be noted, these imperfect people imagined a system where people would serve out of nobility and not out of the pursuit of power, which was immediately destroyed.
Or self-interest.
Yeah, self-interest, which was immediately destroyed. As they showed in Hamilton, Aaron Burr switches parties, changes allegiances left and right just to gain power because he wants to be in the room where it happened. Or where it happens. And it also relies on an informed populace making their votes, as opposed to what we currently have. 100%. And the reason why we don't elect the senators anymore like that is because in the early 1900s, it was revealed that almost every state had a massive scandal of essentially bribery to become a senator. You get the level of corruption in the Senate, as far as the selection of senators goes, it was so horrible and so pervasive that it's one of the most interesting how quickly it became was written as amendment and then ratified by almost every state.
And then we just legalized lobbying. So
Yep.
we just changed the name of it.
That's basically what we did. But to the
so
point though is that this is a system built by imperfect people for the idea and the hope that we will become a better people. Didn't always pan out that way. We've had some notable figures throughout history, but those, once again, we're talking about people from a time where, and progress doesn't happen overnight. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton all wrote definitive essays defending the idea of ending slavery. But it's also important to note that slavery was still so popular. Every state had slavery at that point.
Yeah, we talked about that in hindsight of here in 2020, it absolutely makes sense that hey, slavery was terrible. Why didn't it stop? But back then, it was the end thing. It was the standard of the time kind of thing. And absolutely it is that notion of Logan kind of mentioned the Constitution's a mess. It's full of is full of inconsistencies or whatever. So is independence. It's full of contradictions. So is independence. That's the thing. The founding of the nation, full of contradictions, as we see kind of throughout with all these characters and stuff. Enough diving into the kind of the history lesson. Let's look at just kind of the show itself. So this is your first time seeing the show. What were a lot of your kind of thoughts on seeing it for the first time as somebody who, as you've said, kind of you listened to the show many, many times. It's a show that probably could never live up to what was in your head.
Yeah, I tweeted that out, and I talked to you about it in depth during our conversation a couple days ago. But here's the thing: I was surprised with how little color there was to the musical. I rewatched parts of it since then, and I'm like, I get it. I understand. What I wanted can't be obtained with stage productions as they exist right now.
Yeah, I specifically rewatched it after we talked because you had specifically said that you wanted a red a red to start kind of intensifying and coming over Burr in wait for it, and in rewatching
I was in the room where it happened.
Oh, okay.
Burr's
you'd said that you wanted the sunrise or the sun, the pink
peach,
wash,
a pink peach wash on Aaron Burr at most times.
Mm-hmm.
But then, specifically not during the war. The war needed, in my mind, the war needs this. This is part of the problem. I'm seeing it in my mind, and I'm thinking about these color palettes that I want to assign to it. Each character has their own palette assigned to them, and in my mind, they're that's unrealistic.
Okay, how does that work when all those characters are on stage at once?
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly. I basically mentioned lighting theory doesn't quite work, and especially one of the things that I think the show should really be celebrated for that I remember coming up in theater is lighting a cast of non-white actors is drastically different than lighting a cast of white actors.
And to have everybody
and costuming and all that stuff.
The fact that almost every race is represented on stage.
Yeah.
Lighting is going to be a bitch on that one.
Yeah, the red wash that I feel you see in your mind's eye does come into play during Your Obedient Servant.
Yes, it does. Which is why I was I wanted this for a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah, when Burr makes the decision to fucking act and is out for blood against Hamilton, that's when the red rage comes and you see him just kind of in that wash of light. But yeah, so you clearly had in your head you had ideas of how this would be done or could be done. Maybe not could be done, but you had ideas
of how I
over
wanted
the years of how you wanted to see it.
This is literally. I looked over the dates range. I was like, this is 4 or 5 years worth of I've been listening to the soundtrack over and over in my head and listening to it on so in depth and to the point where I in my head I have choreographed the entire production of Hamilton as far as where I want people to do things, how I want things to be done. I would leave the dancing stuff to other people because I'm not a dancer. I'm certainly not a theater performing dancer. I would definitely leave that to whoever would need to be in charge of that. But for me personally, like the blocking. Let me rephrase that. I have blocked out all of Hamilton in my mind with about
Yeah.
3 different types of stage designs that I would want to utilize for it. One thing I didn't mention to you is that in my mind, I always imagined a slanted writing desk, like a moderately sized slanting writing desk that actually like symbolizes a sense of power and authority of the written word and influence in the world around you. Where when George Washington is introduced, he starts off on the balcony and then he walks down and he basically is walking through troops basically, and then he takes his place at this station, and that's where it's introduced, and that's introduced there to kind of be like, this is where power lies. And then when Alexander Hamilton makes his plea to it, Washington ushers him to the seat, and I would have Berg have a glance at that before leaving stage. And like having that basically like, and that from that point on, whenever there's like a big moment where there's going to be writing done, have that be a center focal piece. So especially impactful when George Washington leaves it, and like takes his leave when Washington's going home, would be a big pivotal moment where basically that desk is left emptied for what is basically the rest of the show.
Because John Adams we never see in the show, so
and
that
specifically
seat wouldn't be filled,
John
and then we
Adams,
don't really focus too much on Jefferson's presidency, because Jefferson's presidency was what and Hamilton's kind of
died
endorsement.
Yeah, Hamilton died not long after that. The Hamilton's last like point where he would be at that is so when he writes the Reynolds pamphlet, he writes it and then he leaves it in a very impactful way during Burn. Is that like the Reynolds pamphlet basically ended his career in politics, and so he leaves that station, and then when he returns to it, it's during the election of 1800, where when he finally makes that big long letter explaining like why he supports Jefferson. During that entire section, that's him writing down at that point, like, and standing there and giving that speech. Like I said, I'm getting way too in the weeds on this. My apologies, but like I have blocked out this show in so many different ways over the last 5 years that like there's no way that like the interpretations in my head and how like picture perfect and crisp it is going to be able to like play out on an actual stage. It's just unrealistic.
Mm-hmm. And so instead, the show has kind of a two-layered set that you and I kind of talked on a little bit the other day about. Like the top layer doesn't really get utilized all that much. It is very much like the action takes place front and center on the main floor for the most part. But you have a couple turntables that kind of help move some of the action around. And,
the turntables are awesome.
Kind of...
Like the use of the turntable is fantastic. It really speaks to the direction of the play when you have a turntable, much less having 2 turntables the way they do.
Yeah.
And utilizing them in a way that makes it so Gamage, where you and I have seen shows, has a turntable. And
Gamage has whatever it needs. Like Gamage is a malleable space. Yeah. When they brought Hamilton through here, they set up the two turntable system. Because it's basically like that is an element. I mean, like I've built turntables for shows and stuff like that. It's not difficult to do. 2 intertwined turntables is a little trickier, but it's a theatrical convention that can be utilized.
So, did not know all of that because I did not stay in theater long enough to learn that. But I would also state that like the first time I saw Les Miserables was at Gamage in. Gosh, this must have been
and that was and turntable was one of like the big things that like Les Mis, I think, really kind of revolutionized in theater.
Okay, there you go. I didn't know that.
The turntable was like back the original Broadway production, and so so that's a thing again, like just like the chandelier in Les Mis as well, or no, the chandelier's in Phantom, but yeah, the turntable in Les Mis. Is
a focal point. I did not know that.
Is a focal point of the original production and therefore subsequent toured productions. But like when it's not like a requirement to doing Les Mis. When Phoenix Theater did Les Mis, they don't have the space in their venue necessarily to do that show with a turntable. So instead, they just had like the barricade that kind of was constructed and then like manually turned for that sequence. I think if they even did that, or they might have even like taken it apart and really just kind of like shown you back into Behind the Barricade. But yeah, the turntable in Les Mis was very much like a pun intended, I guess, turning point in the technological side of theatrical history.
Oh, that's interesting.
And especially like big budget stuff on Broadway.
I bring that up because, and the reason I brought it up is because when I saw Les Mis as a kid, they use it in the beginning when Jean Valjean's going from place to place looking for work.
Yep.
They use it so brilliantly to show you a passage of time and a point of progress. Like, it's not like, oh, he goes to one side of the stage and, oh no, it has to go to the other side of the stage. Oh no. They use it to show him like traveling through the countryside of France looking for work, to like where he ends up. And they use that brilliantly in the same way in Hamilton to show, especially during the war scenes, during the battle, like the Battle of Yorktown, they use it brilliantly to show like distance and space in such a unique and brilliant way, to show like the battle. This is how the battle is happening. People are maneuvering through it. It's such a brilliant use of the set design for it, and so I love seeing that because I didn't even know that it had two turntables in the set. So like that totally just changed a lot for me. Like rewatching certain scenes where like they're using that perfectly to like display movement and passage of time, and like really if you're going to be bringing in a character for a brief cameo, perfect way, swing them around on one of the turntables, like have it stop for a moment, then swing them back around. Perfect. Done and done. They do that with Mr. Reynolds at one point. And I just thought it was brilliant.
I remember specifically like hearing, before I ever saw anything from the show, I remember hearing it had two turntables, and I thought they were doing like a pun on like two turntables and a microphone or something, and I thought it was set up like
brilliant.
Side by side turntables. And it wasn't until I actually saw it that it was one turntable within another turntable. So it's basically like there's the outer ring and then the inner thing. And there are times in the show where both of them are basically turning in tandem, but then there are other times where they're turning in opposite directions or they're turning at different speeds or stuff like that. There's a very fascinating video out there that I would encourage people to go check out if they can find it. So Hamilton very famously would do what they called the ham for ham kind of like pre-show, where in inviting people to come and enter the lottery for the show, where you could enter your name, and if you were selected, you could get Hamilton tickets for $10 for a Hamilton. In order to like further incentivize and reward the people that were trying to get those tickets, so even if they weren't leaving empty-handed, they would do regular ham for ham shows, basically while those people waited in line or waited to hear if they were going to get tickets. And there was one on National Stage Manager Day, celebrating the stage managers, where they basically perform 10 Dual Commandments. Like the whole cast and crew comes out to perform 10 Dual Commandments while... and the only person mic'd for that performance is the stage manager. And the stage manager is basically going through their book and making all the calls.
Oh, that's so cool.
So they're saying, like, lights 1, go, turntable, go, and doing that kind of thing. And it's fascinating to see them perform that number in particular without the turntables, because you see just how much more ground the performers have to cover to kind of keep in configuration and stuff like that. So it's a really cool kind of other look at that show, but also you're also seeing just how many different lighting and sound and tech calls that the stage manager is having to make for just that one number. So I'll try and remember to link that video in the episode, in the notes of this particular episode. But yeah, there's again I was trying to look it up as you were talking, but I couldn't find it off the top of my head or quickly enough. But they talk about Les Mis and the turntable from Les Mis being an inspiration for the show. And then when they landed, originally they even were exploring the idea of a turntable and then like the inner portion being like a pool of water or something like that. And they kind of ended up squashing that idea. But yeah, they they ultimately, when they landed on two turntables, one within another, and Andy Blankenship, the choreographer, was like, okay, this opens up some really cool ideas that we can explore and play around with. And so yeah, you end up getting some very cool and beautiful moments in the show. One of which that always jumps out to me is right after Hamilton gets shot, you have him standing on the outer turntable, and that turntable kind of like continues to move, and you have a couple of the ensembles members that like sit down beside it and row Hamilton across to the other shore
that was
and stuff.
awesome.
And it's just a beautiful staging moment that you get when you have that kind of technological device. But to your point earlier of how you've envisioned this show, there will absolutely be productions of Hamilton done in the future that don't feature turntables at all. And it's going to be people bringing in new lens to these moments and new ways to stage these moments, that kind of explore new ideas and stuff. This was how they chose to do it, and it's how you will see it if you go and see, the official national tour on Broadway kind of thing. But when you start seeing the performance rights go up, like high schools that are going to do Hamilton aren't going to be able to invest the resources into creating two turntables in their systems and stuff that. So
I just remember Ben talking about how he was in his high school production of Mulan.
Yeah.
And I immediately envisioned my high school, which was like 95% white.
Yep, and that is a thing that will happen, and there will be predominantly white performances of Hamilton, and they've kind of said like, hey, like we're not gonna hold high schools to the casting requirements that we put in professional productions of that show, but we would hope that they will recognize the intent behind that and try and do the show if they have appropriate casts, or try and find appropriate casts rather than everybody. Like I always think back to and it's actually here in town. There's a theater company called Hale Theater out in Gilbert, and they're actually like a theater chain. They years ago got in a lot of hot water within our community for doing the production "Lend Me a Tenor" in blackface, with one of the characters in blackface. And "Lend Me a Tenor" was originally written with one of the characters. He's basically playing Othello in an operatic version of Othello, and doing it in like Laurence Olivier kind of style in blackface. But that show has since been explored, and they've recognized they can, tell that same story with that character not being a performer in blackface kind of thing. And Hale, just given its very conservative nature, has historically had issues with how they cast some of their shows.
I mean, let's be fair.
And in particular, I remember
their shows are majority of white people, like almost entirely made up of white.
Exactly.
People.
Yeah. The very first show I ever saw performed at Hale, while I was in rehearsal for the next show at Hale, which I was in, they were doing Little Shop of Horrors. And if you're familiar with the show Little Shop of Horrors, there is basically like a Greek chorus of characters that is very much kind of like a Motown troupe, like the Supremes or something like that. And typically and traditionally performed by three African-American women. And seeing three white women singing those songs was like, this is odd. This is weird.
I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but maybe you should have put more thought.
It's not that it can't be done, but maybe it shouldn't be done. Exactly. It's that kind of thing. I feel like
you went off of casting bias rather than putting in serious thought into who you're going to cast for this role.
Yeah.
Which
so
let me
a lot of
casting bias is the massive problem at Hale Theater. And I say this as somebody who's a cousin of like a couple who are like very like known for reprising several roles at Hale Theater. Like the casting at a Hale Theater show is usually pretty questionable.
Mm-hmm. And they got into a lot of hot water as with all the Black Lives Matter kind of conversation.
That was when that was happening.
No, I'm saying just recently in the last month, when kind of Black Lives Matter was flaring up, they were putting out comments in support, and the community basically called them on it and said, your actions don't reflect this. Like, you can say you're supportive, but we've seen what you've done with your shows in the past, and how you only cast African American performers when you absolutely need to, and they don't get treated with respect and that kind of stuff. And so like it went to the extent that they took their, I believe, and I have not checked in on this recently, but like they took their Facebook page down, and they've taken a lot of their social media pages down because people were coming into the comments and saying like, hey, you need to do better. And they've basically they put out a statement to like a third party site saying like, we're going to examine this stuff and do better, but we've taken our social media channels down because we didn't feel it appropriate for our patrons to be harassed in those things. And people were like, okay, they weren't being harassed, or if they were being harassed, it's because they were being racist kind of people. So yeah, it's an ongoing kind of struggle that they're having to kind of deal with and come to terms with.
Like maybe just don't do blackface. I mean, just
ever. And that was one of the things was at the same time that they had done Lend Me a Tenor, Fountain Hills Theater in town had done either a few months before or a few months after they did Lend Me a Tenor, and they reached out to the company and said, hey, we're not comfortable doing the blackface component of it. Is there another solution we can explore? And they other companies had basically like come up and it was basically like, oh, the character is now a clown and they're doing Pagliacci instead of Othello or something like that. And you still get the case of mistaken identity that is the the intent behind that show, without the horrendous racial overtones. And the Ken Ludwig, the kind of playwright behind it, has basically come back and said like, yes, this is the version of the show you should do.
Well, that's also such much more nuanced.
The version of the original version of the show is problematic, and I apologize. And so he is tried to come to terms with it, while other companies were still happy to do the original blackface version and stuff. So yeah, it's an ongoing thing. Anyway, enough about local Arizona theater drama. It is absolutely something that
only you and I would go off on that diatribe.
Yeah. It is something that inevitably will be seen when Hamilton is starting to get produced in other companies. In the same way that when Phoenix Theater did In the Heights, there was controversy over the actor playing Usnavi not being of. He's of, I believe, he's Canadian, but I believe he's of like Palestinian descent. If I'm remembering correctly, he's a friend of mine. I just don't remember what his actual ethnicity was, but it's not Hispanic, it's not Puerto Rican, it's not Dominican Republican, in the way Usnavi is written, and so it was, so him being cast as Usnavi caused some flare-ups in the community of people kind of calling it out and whatnot, and it's an issue, and even as Black Lives Matter kind of conversations flared up, and I don't say flare up at all like derogatorily or whatever. It's as those conversations are happening right now, again and becoming very much in everybody's mind's eye. There was even a kind of a letter of many people of color kind of coming out and saying like, Broadway doesn't do enough, actors equity doesn't do enough, theater in general scenes are still way too white, and so those conversations are happening, and I think a lot of people are trying to listen to those conversations and say, well, what can we do to be better? Arizona Theater Company, to their credit, just hired a friend of mine, Chanel Bragg, African-American woman, as their associate artistic director, kind of in the midst of all this. Obviously, it's unfortunate time anyway, because they're kind of dark with all of the COVID stuff.
Yeah.
But it's still a cool action that backs up the words that they're trying to say in recognition of these kinds of conversations. But yeah, so Hamilton in general, the idea that it I think that all this is kind of stemming from is the makeup of that cast not being the white people that all these actors are portraying is a very interesting dynamic that also speaks to kind of the conversation we're having right now. The idea of like, does this cast, does Christopher Jackson playing George Washington, a black man playing George Washington, is that an attempt to forgive Washington for owning slaves and stuff? And I think Christopher Jackson would be the first to say no, it does not. Like, and there are moments in the show where he specifically has like is black and white soldiers, does this really mean freedom? And he says not yet.
Ooh,
He's the one
yeah.
that has to say no. No, sorry.
Yeah.
And yeah, in the edited out, or the unreleased kind of Cabinet Battle 3, all about that conversation around slavery. It very much is a hard conversation that the founding fathers couldn't get made. But I am a fan of the idea that Hamilton is framed as the show of America's past told through America's present, and it is
Yeah.
bringing in this diverse lens of characters and ethnicities and colors, to play those characters, to shine them in a new light, and to introduce and kind of expose that dichotomy of, yes, these are the founders of our country. They are kind of the people we put up on pedestals and stuff, but they were also flawed humans, and seeing black or Latino actors portray those characters shines a new light on them. It makes us think about them in a different way than if it had been Norbert Leo Butz and a whole bunch of other white people on that stage, and just even the telling of the show as through hip hop. And obviously, take anything I'm saying with a grain of salt, and anything Cam's saying as a grain of salt, as a couple of white guys talking about.
I wanted to mention that a couple of times.
A hip hop musical, but as somebody who is an avid theater goer, and much like Lin-Manuel Miranda himself will identify himself as like a lover of theater and a lover of hip hop kind of thing. I don't have the necessarily the ties to hip hop as much as he does, but like using that language to tell this story, littered with references to famous hip hop. You see it in the end credits of the Disney Plus. Like every song that has references to like the 10 Crack Commandments, or various other kind of musical interludes from hip hop as well as from musicals, get recognized in the end credits of the film. Here, even if it's just like a violin trill or something that's meant to evoke one of those songs, like Lin-Manuel Miranda like went out of his way to really like highlight all of those things, and in many cases he reached out to the artist to even get their permission to use them in Hamilton itself, where he could. So I think it like there is something powerful about that is helping. It certainly helped open my eyes up to a lot of these conversations and these ideas, compared to one of the things Logan and I talk about was the idea that like my exposure to so many of these characters was the things I learned from high school, which was oftentimes coming from like one set of textbooks or something like that, and not getting the different layers of these characters, not getting the other sides to that story and whatnot. This show at least is trying to expose a lot of that information, or at least get you to question what you think about a lot of these characters, and it's something I very much appreciate. So Cam, in the show in particular, rather than like just big theme stuff or how you would want to stage it, who are some of your favorite characters from the show, and what are some of your favorite like moments or songs from the show?
I mean, I will say this. I mentioned it earlier, but Daveed Diggs can take me wherever and however he wants to. Lafayette and Jefferson, pairing these two characters together by the same actor is a stroke of brilliance. And there's several reasons why, but I love the idea that when Lafayette leaves, he is at the peak of his character arc is fulfilled. And what we're introduced to is a part of the reason why I love Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton's dynamic in this, one, Daveed Diggs and Lin-Manuel Miranda have, between being able to be buddy best friends to going at each other's throats, is phenomenal. Several songs that Jefferson's a part of, Washington on Your Side, phenomenal. like from his introduction with Daveed Diggs channeling Prince on so many levels. Just that entire performance is just phenomenal.
Well, I think one of the things they touch on in
Oh, sorry.
the book, because I'm trying to pull up a couple specific songs here and a couple specific footnotes. But what did I miss? Specifically, they talk about the idea. Here's a footnote from What Did I Miss. Figuring out the sound of Thomas Jefferson was a fun challenge. My reasoning: he's a full generation older than Hamilton, and he was absent for much of the fighting of the Revolutionary War, though certainly an architect of some of the founding documents, so I wrote him in a sort of Lambert Hendricks, Ross, Gil Scott Heron mode, jazzy proto-hip-hop, but not the boom bap of Hamilton. He was just as much fun with words, but they swing and they sing. So he's very much kind of like his absence during the first act is kind of reflected in What Did I Miss, and the very jazzy nature of that, as opposed to the more hip hop centric nature of anything that we'd seen so far up to that point.
So sorry, I forgot to mention one of the reasons why historically I love that dynamic is because for people who aren't aware, we're not sure how Hamilton around the time of his death felt about Jefferson outside of the address he gave to the delegates of the Electoral College that you see that when he gives his speech.
That is personified here of Jefferson has my vote.
Jefferson has my vote. Out after that point, his relationship with Jefferson is largely unknown. But what we do know is that in Monticello, there is a hallway to, I believe it's to Jefferson's personal study, but I might be wrong about its placement. But there's two busts on each side looking at each other, and one is of Jefferson himself and the other is of Alexander Hamilton, and he often revered Hamilton as his great rival. Something I've never particularly cared for in the show is the conclusion, and I shouldn't say that I don't care for it. It is a good point to make, but once again it builds off of the ambiguity of Jefferson and Hamilton's relationship before Hamilton's death, and what the exact nature of their friendship is, especially once Jefferson becomes president because of Hamilton's influence. But it was very clear that as far as Jefferson was concerned, he saw Hamilton as a somewhat of a friend, but definitely of his greatest political rival. And the respect he had for Hamilton based off of that was enough that that's how he referred to him. He put him up on a pedestal as being not just like on his level, but his equal when it comes to political debate and discussion. And it's also really sad because when you think about it, during the Constitutional Convention, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are best friends. But by the time they're actually building the country together, they're at such odds that it actually really hurts their friendship. But as you saw, as you see at the very end, you see Madison gives that very beautiful moment of recognizing the achievements and accomplishments of his friend. So it's Hamilton's life being cut so short is painful when you think about what good he still could have done if he still had more time, which plays into the final number with Liza. There's just, I'm sorry, I'm bouncing all over the place here with this, but there's so many moments that I love about this show. So many characters. Liza, of course, is like the pinnacle of just being wonderful.
Real quick before we dive into Eliza, I just want to throw a shout out there to a Lafayette line as well. Yes. From just giving your love of, again, Daveed Diggs, from Guns and Ships. Lafayette, of course, has "Sir, he knows what to do in the trench, ingenuitive and fluent in French. I mean Hamilton. So you're going to have to use him eventually. What's he going to do in the trench? I mean Hamilton. No one has more resilience or matches my practical tactical brilliance." That line has the footnote: "The speed at which Lafayette rhymes here was always meant to be a punchline. Here's Lafayette, the Frenchman, who struggles with the word anarchy in my shot, and he's a speed demon. It's also meant to demonstrate how Lafayette flourished once he was put in command. He goes from being one of Hamilton's friends to a rap god / military superhero. Doesn't hurt that Daveed is one of the most technically gifted rappers I've ever met. So I knew I could build him tapestries. It was actually his idea to wrap this resilience brilliance rap in a triplet rhythm, which is perfect. So yeah, again, shout out to Daveed Diggs and what he brings to both of those characters.
100%. And it's difficult
So,
because
but diving
I have
into
a new appreciation for the double casting. As we covered already, I was surprised by some of it because when you listen to it, as much as I have, I've always kind of seen them as different actors. Hercules Mulligan and James Madison being the same actor is just mind-blowing to me because I've imagined them as such different characters and such different people. But yeah, it's incredible.
The reason it came up in Logan's episode was because Logan's girlfriend Stravia didn't recognize that they were the same person either. So I was like, oh yeah, Cam and I talked about that too. So yeah, it is, and one of the things that Logan in particular really appreciated about James Madison is how sickly he is, because it is true to life for the character at that time, and it's not something that like it gets a little bit of
only
play in some of the
act,
lines
though.
and stuff.
It's important to note that it's only during the period of time that James Madison was actually sick. Afterwards, in Act 3, he no longer carries the handkerchief around his mouth. He doesn't keep it around his mouth anymore, as a reflection of he had recovered from, I believe he had pneumonia at the time.
And by Act 3, you mean what, like the epilogue kind of thing?
No, by Act 3, when they confront him about what he's done.
I mean, there are 2 acts in the show. So,
Sorry,
so
why
you're
am I
saying
thinking there's 3 acts? There's 2 acts. Second act. I always break it up It's Quiet Uptown has always been to me like an act break, and I am just now realizing there's no act break there. It's just 2 acts.
Yeah. No, it's the act break is after nonstop. So and then we get to and that's where like intermission happens. All of the actors change to their other roles, and then you get What Did I Miss to kick off the second act. So you're saying he probably in
at the very during
like in the lead up to what would that be in the
let's let him know
like right before. Yeah, right before Reynolds.
Yeah, right before Reynolds' pamphlet, he no longer is like covering his mouth anymore with a handkerchief.
Yep.
And then from there, he's totally fine. But that does focus on Hamilton's illness during the very beginning of the Washington administration. Madison's his illness during the beginning of the Washington administration did keep him from being a largely vocal opponent against Hamilton. And Hamilton did take a good chunk of control of government affairs because he had Washington on his side. Jefferson's frustration with Washington. So Washington and Jefferson are age contemporaries, and so when Jefferson sees Hamilton like having Washington wrapped around his finger like that, it frustrates him because it's contrary to Jefferson and the American people's idea of who Washington is as this bold, strong leader, and kind of seeing like a man behind the scenes pulling the strings of what he considered to be a puppet at that time. Like the relationship between George Washington and the deterioration of a great endearing friendship to just not a great relationship over the course of Washington's administration is noteworthy. So.
Yeah. Any other big either moments in the show you want to kind of highlight? Any were there any surprises for you outside of like, oh, they staged it differently than I would have?
Burn is this is the first time I told you this is the first time I've listened to Burn. And it's funny because I listened to Burn afterwards while in my car yesterday, and I cried. So the song still makes me cry, but the way that it's done on stage is actually like I'm very emotionally removed from that because it's just not as. It's such a powerful song that just the staticness of her there's just not enough. There's not enough going on for such an important, powerful song. And I don't. You could say that it's intentional. You could say that like the way they staged it is the way that it's supposed to be, and that's fine. But it doesn't move me. Mm-hmm. And yeah.
Is it? I mean, like for me, it strikes me as like because I can absolutely, devoid of facial expressions and stuff. I can see myself be like reacting emotionally to that. But seeing her and seeing how strong she's trying to be in the face of this, as her world falls apart? Is that what makes it like what makes it harder to, emotionally like release in that moment? Do you think?
I would definitely say that's a great interpretation. My compromise on that would be start the song off extremely emotional, and then when she says like she's gonna cut herself from the narrative, that's when you cinch it. That's when you cinch the emotions closed. Maybe that would be a good point, because otherwise she starts off the song very cold. Like the song is such a powerful song and such an emotional turmoil, like
Mm-hmm.
embedded into the various notes of the music and the lyrics. To have her expression the entire time be so cold feels like it doesn't, to me it doesn't display strength. um it just displays a lack, like it's strange because she's so impassioned and filled with energy and warmth and heat, and just like this idea of like this warm calming light that just expresses itself through everything she does, um being like cut off in that moment, but without any, like there's no moment where we see the, like, her cutting herself off and like enclosing herself in a shell of an emotionless person. It's just given to us that that's where she's at now, and
Yeah, I
there
guess
the
the
transition, the
thing
lack
I'm
of
trying.
transition is what bothers me.
Well, the thing I'm really trying to, yeah, what I'm trying to hone in on is like without any kind of facial reaction, it's an emotional song for you. Like you can listen to it and you cry. And I would imagine when she was performing it in the recording studio or whatever, she's performing it with the same, intensity and vigor that she does on stage. So like she delivered the same probably performance, on the recording as you see on stage. So it's curious. Like if you
There is a
like if
dissonance.
you close
Yeah.
your eyes of it's what you're seeing isn't connecting to what you're hearing.
Yeah,
Basically, is what it seems to
there's a
be.
visual and
What you're
auditory
seeing
dissonance
is,
between the
yeah.
two that I can't reconcile. And so that's the only part of, like, now that we've talked and I've like gone back and watched some stuff, that's really the only thing that I would like strongly like emphasize, like at least some sort of change. Because to have her, and don't get me wrong, because the trade-off, like the great part about her going that cold is that when Philip dies, there's just this torrent of emotion that's unleashed and just like brings me just to becoming like that when she bursts out in emotion and horror at her son dying, like I curled up into a ball on my couch and was bawling, like I was crying. And it's just like it's such an incredible, like, without her being so cold throughout that brief part of the production, I don't know if that's going to give me, like, if that burst of emotion and pain, and because it's compounded, because it's the pain of being betrayed by the man that you love more than anything in the world, to losing your firstborn child is a compounded pain that is just, she can't hold it in anymore. And I do, like, as somebody who's watching the production, I love, and as somebody who's feeling the hurt and pain that she's delivering with her performance, I dread. So, like, there's a lot of that, but that's the only real thing that I would say I would make I would make any sort of significant change to.
Okay. And I'm curious.
Everything else is
It's
amazing and
something
I love it, and it should, like, it's perfect. So
I talked to Logan about this because, the song that's obviously not on the album, is basically Lawrence's death.
yeah.
That's like the one, like the big surprise for people who've only ever listened to the show, seeing it for the first time, that hadn't done, like I knew about it because I'd looked into, the research and is there anything in the show that's not, on the album kind of thing. So I had known about it before going in and
I had
seeing it,
to.
but I remember watching YouTube videos of it, and just being like, oh fuck, that wrecked me.
Oh, I will
So
say,
seeing it
yeah.
in the broader context of the show, did that, so you said you did know about that kind of going
Yeah,
in,
of course.
but how was it seeing it?
So let me rephrase that. this is the second thing that I would change about the show. He's
Okay.
sitting at like a writing desk where he's writing stuff, letters and stuff. I would have preferred it if he had been, and this is part why I brought this up to you before. There's no children in this entire show. Like there's no child actors.
Yeah.
Oh, and this actually brings up a third thing I would change. So actually, a second.
Again, I think appropriately by design, you don't like to bring in to bring in a child actor just to play Philip at age
Oh no, no, no,
9
no, no, that's not what I would use.
is not nearly worth the time.
Because the point would not be to have him play Philip at 9. It would be to have him play Philip as like the young Philip.
But like there isn't young Philip. There's baby. There's Theodosia and Philip being born. But yeah, there's not like young child Philip outside of Philip at age 9.
I would insert in Theodosia. I would put like young early toddler Philip, because I would also use that as
Like
this is,
that's
this
a
is
film.
why,
That's not a play.
Well, this is why. This is
like,
why, Trevor. Because when she says she brings up the orphanage, there's no orphans on the stage, Trevor. There's no orphans there.
So what?
It would be
so
much
what?
of a bigger impact if there's like a reveal of an orphans.
No, it
Yes,
would
it
not. It would not at
It'd
all.
be amazing.
You are
if
not
she
going
says,
to.
"Let me show you what what I'm proud of."
You are one of the worst directors if you would want to cast a child to only appear at the end of this show for that line. And that's like, I'm not saying that you can't do that and you partner with like a local school or something and you bring in those kids to fill the stage with an orphanage or something, but you're not going to.
Not like a bunch of kids, just like maybe one or two. Or let me rephrase that.
You're not going to pay a kid to be on to especially again with child labor laws and stuff. You're definitely not going to get a toddler actor to be Theodosia or whatever, because hey, Cameron, they don't grow up 5 years in the middle of the show. So they can't like be a baby and then come back and be a toddler at the end of the show or something.
No. I don't want them to, that's not what I want. I want it to be the same actor. Like, but we use them first as baby Philip in bed. So during the Lawrence thing, he's by his son, and like I think that would be such an impactful moment. And then the second thing would be when she reveals the orphanage and she says like I see you in them. All that. Anyway, never mind. We clearly are diametrically opposed foes on this, but
it's a terrible idea.
It's probably a terrible idea. But
any producer is going to be like, no, we're not doing that, Cameron.
And that's fair. And that would definitely be a discussion that would have to happen, because that's what I want.
Also, we can't light every character in their own
I'm well
colors.
aware of that, Trevor. I'm well aware of that. It's not possible. The things I want are not possible for modern theater.
And that's
all right.
So that's what I'm saying. Like what you're describing is the film version of the show. Like having Aaron Burr and Hamilton. No, I'm saying like the when they do the Cats version of it, that is not staging the film or whatever it is.
I don't want that at all.
Like they will have Aaron Burr and Hamilton singing Dear Theodosia over their baby bassinets or something like that. That you will absolutely see when this gets a proper version directed by Ryan Coogler or something like that. But yeah, it's just not feasible to do something like even on stage. You very rarely see in largely adult shows. You very rarely see like kids, and when you do see kids, they can't just cast like one kid. They have to have basically two sets of casts or something like that. The an example I would go to is point to is Shrek the musical. You have like young Fiona who sings her number, and she alternates with young Shrek who's like walking off at the beginning of that show as the parents send young Shrek away, and those kids trade off every night, and one of them ends up like whoever isn't baby Fiona. Or young Fiona, like Fiona at age 9 or something like that, ends up also playing like a dwarf at the end of the show when they're doing like the Smash Mouth rock concert thing at the end. And it's because like, hey, yeah, that kid now has to do like has to be there for their one number at the beginning of the show and then come out for curtain call at the end and also just sit there and do nothing the whole rest of the show. And so somebody has to be taking care of that kid backstage. during rehearsals they had to be making sure the kid was, doing all the appropriate like school stuff and everything. So yeah, it's just very, very rare that you see children in something not community theater driven. Like, yeah, when Desert Stages does this show, sure, they will probably cast real kids to be the kids, and they will probably put a whole bunch of orphans on stage for the orphanage number at the end, just so, I talked about this with Logan too, just so that the parents of all those kids buy tickets to come see the show and help support Desert Stages. You will absolutely probably see that. But in professional production, it's going to be very unlikely.
Well, I gave you what I wanted.
Keep dreaming, Cameron.
I gave you what I wanted, and I'm not I'm not going to get it. I'm never going to direct this show. I'm never going to direct this show. Like, there's no future where that's happening unless I decide I want to do it with my own money, and that's not going to happen.
9-year-old Philip's going to be a 9-year-old kid writing his big slanted writing desk with yellow light on him or something like that, shining on him. All that fun stuff. Well, any other highlights or favorite moments or anything else you want to kind of touch on before we kind of close out the show here, Cam?
No, I'm good.
You good? All right.
I think I didn't even
I've crept on your ideas enough.
I honestly, I also think like we've been talking about Hamilton for almost 2 hours, and like I think we're good.
Oh, the episode with Logan was about 2.5 hours.
Yeah, but
so and I will be talking for so many hours with so many people about Hamilton. And yes, you and I have already talked for like an extra hour or two about Hamilton the other day.
There's a non-recorded hour discussion of me trying to explain to you like what the color theory and palette should be for every character in Hamilton. So
yeah. Well, okay, let's dive into the report card then. Grade it from A+ to F. As I graded it in my episode with Logan, I stand firmly by an A+. Where do you put this, Cam?
If I could give it an A++, can I give it an A++?
I mean, if you want, sure. Breaks our scale.
I give it an A++. But like I give it that extra plus. It's 110% percentage-wise.
It's our Dave Meltzer 5.5 stars.
Pretty much, or 6 stars. Like 100%. It breaks the scale. It's so unbelievably phenomenal. Like it just is.
Yeah. Oh, what did you think? Because this is something that I'm like. One of the things I'm most fascinated about is Jonathan Groff, his whole spittle thing and drool and stuff in his performances as King George. Because we didn't really talk about King George at all, but what did you think about that?
Incredible.
Seeing that and seeing it in performance.
It's incredible. Like Jonathan Groff is. I talked about it. The reason I guess I didn't bring it up is because I talked about it enough in the Frozen episodes, where I talked about how like incredible Jonathan Groff is as a performer, and how in Frozen 1 he doesn't sing except a dumb reindeer song, and he's just such a phenomenal actor and performer, and like his King George is perfect. I did not realize that King George stuck around after his last song for such a long time.
Yeah, that was another thing. That was something that came up in Logan's episode too. The fact that he just sits there and just watches Hamilton destroy himself with the Reynolds pamphlets,
and like he reads
and
it,
just dances along, does a little jig on his chair and stuff. Yeah, it's a great
the
little,
entire
it's
structure
again
of
it's
that
another
entire part where he's just like in the background, just like happy and glee about like the destruction of his victorious enemies.
Yeah. Little moments that character has are great. One of the things that jumped out at me, and a lot of fun has been made about it on Twitter and stuff, but the idea that like they specifically brought him back to come in and do the show. He had already left the show at this point, and he came in for these 3 days of basically filming to kind of honor the spirit of it being the original cast. And the fact that they like do those close-up shots and could have reshot moments where he's not drooling or spitting out and having like that little spittle kind of like drip down his chin. They could have reshot those moments and done a more like pristine version of it, but I love that they didn't.
That's
I love that they,
George III. King George III was.
Well, yes, he's also mad and crazy and frothing at the mouth.
He's frothing at the mouth, but he's also like. It's important to note, King George III knew he was mentally unstable before he took the crown, but he was basically forced to take the crown. This is an important thing to note as well. King George III was a farmer before he was king. He was not the heir to the throne. He was not going to take control of the country. He was like a gardener and a farmer. Like that was that's what he enjoyed in life. King George III hated being king. Hated the entire like monarchy, the structure of everything, but he was just kind of like lopped into it and hated it till his dying day. So fun note about that. So drooling at the mouth, totally within King George III's like repertoire of like the bananas, like the things that he did as king to like free up like in his pastime. Bonkers bananas man. But anyway,
Yeah, I'm just saying you would typically see something like that especially in a production filmed for a at home audience kind of thing. You typically see that like reshot to not have that element in there. But I do appreciate that they kept it in there to just add to the theatricality of the show. And yep, like he was really that into the performance that he's spitting out there on the orchestra and the conductor and probably the front row every night or something. So shout out to Jonathan Groff as King George III. So you gave it an A++. Great. A little bit of extra credit for people if you like this. I'm assuming you got the same immediate suggestion that I did and that many others I've seen did, where the first thing that it spits out is like, hey, if you like this, watch The Sound of Music. And it's like, those are very different musicals, but okay, sure.
I did not get that.
Oh, you did not? Do you know what Disney Plus recommended for you?
It was another musical that they have on there.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember what it is. It's
So you might like this suggestion because the next one that came up was Annie, which has tons of orphans in it for you.
Wasn't
So
Annie either.
Maybe that's the show you want. You also had Newsies, the
that
Broadway
came
musical
up for me.
version
That's
of
the one that came up
Newsies.
for me.
It was
Yeah,
Newsies.
Newsies.
That's the one that of the 8 that like they have on their like suggestions page. That's the one that makes the most natural sense as like hey, if you like this staged musical, watch this other staged musical that we produced. They also have a celebration of music from Coco. They have Encore, the series from with Kristen Bell. They have the original Mary Poppins on there. They have High School Musical, the musical, the series, and then they have the film version of Newsies. So they have both iterations of Newsies popping up there in the suggested stuff. A couple other little extra credit things for you that I throw on top of all that. I encourage people to check out Lin-Manuel Miranda performing at the White House Poetry Jam back in May of 2009. This is where he debuted the original number of Alexander Hamilton, and it's very much like almost it's not complete one for what ends up being in the final show, but like it's 95%
because
there.
It originally wasn't
like
meant to be a musical.
Exactly. He talks about that in the introduction in that video. He talks about like he's working on a concept album, a concept hip hop album about somebody he identifies as somebody who personifies hip hop for him, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. And the camera cuts over to President Barack Obama and Michelle Obama laughing about that. And then by the end of like what they see him perform, everybody gives him a standing ovation, and it's clear. Like from there, it's clear that he was onto something. But then, he spends the next 6 to 7 years turning that from a concept album to coming up with other songs for it to ultimately the play that we end up getting. So I will include the YouTube video for that in the comments below, as well as the YouTube video that I mentioned earlier, if I can find it, for the stage manager version of the 10 Duel Commandments, performed outside of the Rogers Theater. And then I'm also including a little snippet from a Facebook video that I was in on in Hamilton's official social media channels back in July 2017. They were doing a little giveaway contest thing where if you donated, you get entered to go see Hamilton on Broadway or something like that. I didn't win, but they also were encouraging people to, shoot a little video of themselves performing a bit of Hamilton. And I did the opening number of Alexander Hamilton at like 2 to 3 times speed. So I just kind of like rushed through the opening bit there. And I posted it on Twitter, and they took my video and included it in a little in one of their social media videos alongside people like J.J. Abrams and stuff. So I went in, I found that video, which, as I said in last episode, was exciting for me because I got introduced to the idea that I was in that video by one of my friends in the theater community, basically like who had seen it on the Hamilton page and then was like, "Oh my God, Trevor, is this you?" And I was like, "Yep, that's me." So you can go check that out in the description below as well. Extracurriculars. You watching anything else on Disney Plus, Cam?
No, I haven't really had much time to watch anything else.
That's fair. I mentioned in the last episode, which I recorded, 5 hours ago or whatever it is now. But I've been watching a lot of other MCU movies and stuff like that because I'm going to be helping a friend out as I've been called in as a ringer for an upcoming MCU trivia night through a Zoom call kind of thing. So been brushing up on a lot of the MCU movies and kind of catching up on that stuff. So that's where I've been. So yeah, that's going to do it for this episode of That D Plus Show. Thank you, Cameron, for joining me to talk about Hamilton, an American musical. I very much have appreciated, our conversations about Hamilton over the years, but now that you've finally seen it as well, I appreciate your interpretation, and as wrong as I think they might be, I appreciate that you have like such stark visions in your head of what you would want to do with the show. You can follow Cameron at Rev Cabot on Twitter. Anything you want to give a plug or shout out to, Cameron?
Yeah, I'm gonna be on this upcoming episode of, I don't know if this airs. Does this air before That News You Care About?
This one will probably be the episode the week after,
yeah.
so it'll be people can have listened to you on That News You Care
About. Yeah, I was
About.
on that. You can go check that out.
Yeah, Cameron and I, right before we sat down and recorded this, we recorded a segment for That News You Care About with Cameron kind of talking about a lot of the recent Evo cancellation amidst kind of scandal, accusations, and and controversy, as well as a lot of the fighting, the controversy in the Smash Brothers scene. Cameron, as our resident kind of esports and fighting game resident expert there, it was fitting that he chime in on that. So if you listen to as of when this is going live, it would probably be last week's episode. Or if I end up doing like doubling up and doing 2 shows a week, it'll still have been the most recent episode of That News You Care About that you could have heard Cameron on. So definitely check that out. You can follow me at Trevor J. Starkey on Twitter, and as I said, this is the second one of these Hamilton-centric Disney Plus D Plus show episodes that I've recorded. I have at least 2 more kind of in the docket to sit down with people on, and I hope to have a handful more of those conversations because I just love talking about Hamilton with people. So check out those other iterations if you've enjoyed this conversation. If you want to be one of those people, reach out to me on Twitter and let me know, like, hey, I love Hamilton, or I want to talk about Hamilton. I'd never seen Hamilton, but let me sit down and watch it. I'm eager to have any and all conversations around Hamilton. So you can hit me up there. If you liked what you heard, please like, rate, review, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends, and all that fun stuff. And if you do feel so inclined, you can always support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. Thank you for joining us. As always, thank you, Cameron, for joining me. And then, as always, stay nerdy, be good to each other, and class dismissed.